Kraut. How Denmark invented social democracy. I'm Swedish, and this is a video about Denmark. I think it's a positive video about Denmark. So every fiber of my being is very, very skeptical towards this video and its contents, especially if it's going to have a positive connotation. But we'll see. How Denmark invented social democracy. There's a sponsorship at the beginning.
It's sponsored by Kamikoto Knives. Now I have to tell.
Okay, I'm watching this video. Hey, Kraut sponsoring Kamikoto knives. They're probably cool knives. If I'm yonking your video, I'll say, you know what? Hey, probably a cool sponsorship. But yeah, we'll get to the actual topic of the video, and let's begin. Where is your keyboard? That's all.
Pick up and read some political science books, and I guarantee you that you are going to always encounter one specific phrase. Getting to Denmark. Getting to Denmark is a kind of meme in political science and in particular in developmental economics. It exists because of Denmark's consistency in high living standards. For almost an entire century, Denmark has ranked amongst the top 10 countries in the world, usually as number 1 in highest average living standard, lack of poverty, ease of doing business, quality of public services, government accountability and transparency, freedom of the press, quality of life, quality of healthcare, infrastructure development, and it is also consistently the least corrupt country in the world. Developmental.
Sure, but it's also Denmark. So, I mean, you gotta balance those equations. It's also the land of the Persimmon. Is that Danish? Or I think it's Danish. I don't think it's Norwegian. It's also the land of the Persimmon. So you gotta, infrastructure, economic development, corruption and healthcare and all that. I mean, it's pretty cool, but it's also Denmark. So you gotta like balance those out here. I think that Kraut could do a bit of a better job giving a more balanced perspective so far. But yeah, let's keep going.
Economics is a field of economics that researches and tries to develop policies to improve societies by reforming and restructuring institutions with the intent to improve political, economic, and social structures. As a result of that, when political scientists and economists talk about improving the political and economic conditions of a country, with Denmark being consistently the gold standard in development, they started to say that they were trying to get the country to be more like Denmark, and hence, getting to Denmark became a sort of meme. On the surface, this seems like a great idea. Denmark is a society that works, so let us just copy what works. Denmark has very strict anti-corruption laws and fiscal transparency regulations, which certainly contribute to Denmark's low ranking on the international corruption scale. But the Philippines also has strict anti-corruption laws and regulations, yet they are one of the most corrupt countries in Asia. Simply copying a law does not bring the result you wish to achieve unless you bring with that law the institutional framework that ensures the law has the desired effect. The government institutions of Denmark work because the Danish people trust those institutions, while the institutions of the Philippines are not trusted to function by the Filipinos. Therefore, to understand.
Yeah, that's a good point he makes. I was going to point it out, but then it shows up that he made it. A lot of people will do this where they will be like, oh, look, Denmark or X country does well in X department. Specifically, the example I thought about immediately was like gun laws and gun rights, because I did a video a while back about Angry Foreigner, where I went over one of his videos on Swedish crime, and gun rights and stuff like that came up quite a bit. And it was the exact type of thing where like, oh, okay, they have this law, and intuitively you can think that this law is the main thing contributing to this societal outcome. Therefore, if we just copy paste the law or like the legal framework in general, we will solve everything. When that's absolutely not the case. Like Kraut correctly points out right now, a law has to be contextualized in the general like material conditions of the society in which it is placed. Societal or like trust in the institutions, like he points out with the example of the Philippines, is absolutely one of those very, very important elements. Other important elements can be like GDP per capita or average wealth levels, median wealth levels, wealth inequality within the nation, issues in relation to like segregation, or maybe housing market flexibility, or maybe, population growth or stagnation, depending on what you're talking about. So, for example, Japan has been facing a lot of issues when it comes to population stagnancy and the way that's affecting their population. Just copy-pasting a law, basically, it doesn't ensure the same results. You need to understand the context in which that law is functioning, the population group it's affecting, the, operations and the freedoms and the capabilities and the material and economic position that population is in when that law is placed upon them. All these things need to be really considered and looked into, and that's what makes international comparisons pretty hard. And this is something that's generally talked about, how it becomes very difficult to just compare legal frameworks and countries to outcomes and just use that across the board as like a blanket policy, because you miss a lot of the very important underlying things and the very important contextualizations of those laws that make them function in a desired or non-desired way. So, for example, if we talk about the gun legislation stuff, there is a lot of things that impact like gun violence and stuff like that. And often people will say that like, oh, well, actually we don't need any gun regulation because, you know, look at all these countries, or look at all these, you know, like countries like Switzerland, for example, that have very open gun laws, yet they don't have the same amount of issues with gun violence. And that's kind of mixed true. There is a lot of gun deaths in Switzerland, but when it comes to like violent crime with guns, it is pretty like a lot less than a lot of other countries. But you also then need to look at the country in which that law plays out. So Switzerland being a country with very strong public institutions, with very high average wealth levels, like one of the wealthiest countries in the world, right? And yeah, having a very big focus and emphasis on education as well, and you know, emphatic, is that a word? Or comprehensive like education programs for gun safety and stuff like that, which all contextualize the way that the gun laws function in that given country. So what he points out here, that hey, you absolutely need to look at the context of the country before you just look at the laws and be like, okay, let's just replicate the laws. That's going to be very important, because if that was the case, then pretty much every country would probably just like yoink the entire legal code of like a lot of Scandinavian countries, for instance, and be like, well, we should have the exact same results, when that's obviously not the case. It's not something that can be done super easily.
How we can get to Denmark, we first have to ask how Denmark got to Denmark. To get there, we have to ask a question that is barely ever asked. How did democracy come to Denmark? We all have a surface-level understanding of how other democracies developed. We know the historic developments that led to English democracy. We also know how French democracy developed. But a mistake often made is the assumption that those two are the only paths to liberty. Some Brits make the mistake of assuming that Anglo-American democracy was the only true path to democracy, and that democracy is Britain's gift to the world, while some French people see French republicanism as the only pure and true form of democracy there is. Scandinavia is just conveniently ignored in this. You will find an occasional casual mention of Danish parliamentary democracy being established in 1849, but how it came to be is ignored in popular history. Democracy just appeared out of nowhere, and that seems to be it. But that is not the case. Scandinavia took its own path, separate from Britain, America, and France, unique in its development, which formed the foundation of modern social democracy.
Like, there are two perfectly good countries here, Kraut, on each side of Denmark. Why did you have to focus on Denmark? Like, come on. Like, their flag isn't even as cool. Like, it's just the Norwegian flag, but with less detail. Like, they don't have the cool blue line, the dark blue line in the middle. It's just the inferior country. Come on, you gotta step it up.
There's a prevailing myth that the origins of Scandinavian democracy can be found in pagan Germanic tribal social organization. However, this ignores that the Scandinavians were not the only Germanic peoples marauding through Europe. So did the Franks, Saxons, Visigoths, Lombards, and the Ostrogoths. It also ignores the fact that the Norsemen did not simply stay in Scandinavia. Viking marauders established Viking kingdoms in England, Ireland, Scotland, and France. Let's take the French Viking kingdom, since it had the longest political impact, as an example. The Normans, a Viking people who raided France, were granted lands by the Franks in exchange for peace, established the Duchy of Normandy, and developed feudal governing institutions of absolute monarchy. Norman law, by which the early Norman kingdoms were governed, is distinctively Nordic. The legal text may be in French, but includes Nordic loanwords, and refers to Scandinavian customs such as Danish marriage, that being marriage of women to men of lower social standing, the kidnapping of the bride into forced marriages without the approval of her father, or a form of polygamy by which a man could abandon a wife to just move on to the next, a set of distinctively Viking practices. The prime feature of Norman law is its extreme feudalism. All rights are exclusively reserved to the Duke. He is the only one who can grant privileges and rights, and is the sole judge and executioner of justice. The law underlines the importance of family, clearly outlining that inheritance must go down the eldest son. The law excludes women of all rights and places them under a system of patrimonialism. Women cannot marry, they can only be given away by their fathers, fatherless women have to be given away by their brothers. This Nordic law, in fact, reinforces feudalism, far from being different.
So historical context, I think, that's gonna be a part of the video. Maybe historical things is not something I'm a very big expert on, especially as far back as like feudal era and history and stuff. So I'm just kind of sitting by and listening right now for the moment. I'm more familiar with like kind of history within the past like 100 or 150 or so years, when this seems to be quite a bit before that. I do know, however, that there was a time in history where it's a little secret, okay? Sverige Stormaktstiden. This was a base time, okay? Look at this used to be Sweden. Look at that. Look at how based it used to be. Look at this. Wow.
or even rebellious against feudalism, as some popular historians falsely claim, the Norse people took feudal law and drove it into an extreme. They even disrupted non-feudal social structures and customs. Before the Normans conquered England, its laws had been a set of Frankish and Saxon customs. When a property owner died, his inheritance was split up evenly amongst all his children. After the Norman conquest, property had to be inherited down the eldest son, or it would go back to the lord. Before the Normans, judgment of criminals was undertaken by a lord justice. After the Norman conquest, feudal lords exerted justice as their exclusive right. The guilty were now expected to pay a fine to the court, and thereby to the king. And trial by combat was also introduced. With the Normans also came the notion that all land was property of the king, and that those living upon it were granted the temporary privilege of that land. The romanticized image of an ancient Viking liberty is simply not true. It's a recent trend in popular history to market and present Vikings as romantic explorers and settlers. The Vikings were actually marauders, raiders, slavers, and conquerors who conquered European lands and then became European feudal lords. They also converted to Christianity and became feudal lords back at home in Scandinavia. Scandinavia became a decentralized feudal society with a king at its center. The monarch was weak. By the 13th century, his rights had been bound and limited by a charter which the aristocracy had made him sign. This meant that the centralized state was too weak to organize standing armies or state institutions and could therefore not fend off the German Holsteins who conquered large parts of southern Denmark. Medieval Scandinavia was not that different from the rest of medieval Europe.
Okay, so I guess establishment so far is that it's not really so much in the feudal era that Denmark distinguished itself from a lot of its European contemporaries when it comes to its process and the legacy of the Vikings, so to say. It's not all that different. It's not all that like more advanced or more civilized than other contemporary societies at the time. They talk about like the French and British societies at the moment, or at the time, I should say. So okay, we've established right now that it doesn't seem like it's a feudal area in which there was a big distinguishment when it comes to Denmark's path towards what's the right word, humanitarian development, as compared to the other countries. So not feudal era. Let's find out what the next analysis is.
There's one thing that developed.
Winter is coming. Denmark has the easiest winters out of any Scandinavian countries. Come on, what is this? They have like the baby. They're like, oh, it's so cold. It is barely 0 degrees in Denmark. Oh no, I'm freezing. Maybe we'll get a little bit of snow. Who knows? We'll find out. While up here in the real Nordic countries, in the Norways, in the Swedens, and the Finlands, it can get cold. It can get pretty cold here. Okay, so Danish winter, not something they should be complaining about. Also, I do want to mention there's this funny law I think it's still in the books at the moment, where back when Denmark and Sweden was at war, what's it called? I'm not sure, but the body of water in between Denmark and Sweden that right now has a bridge over it, it used to freeze over. People could walk all the way across from Sweden to Denmark on ice, and there was a law that I think is still in the books that if a Swede ever walks across the ice and goes into Denmark's territory, a Dane is legally allowed to club them over the head. And I think that's on the book. So we'll see. Maybe if it wasn't for global warming, Danes could get away with clubbing some Swedes over the head. But unfortunately, or fortunately for Swedes, I guess, global warming has prevented that method of clubbing people over the head by the Danes. So yeah.
Medieval Scandinavia different from the rest of Europe. Geography. Its rugged geography makes the use of roads difficult, especially during the winter. You couldn't just call a snowplow to clear the streets in 14th century Gotland. But what there was a lot of was coastline. This resulted in seafaring becoming common, and thanks to the abundance of lumber, easy as a means of transportation. It also resulted in a significant socio-economic development. The proximity to the Hanseatic League and its free cities meant that great commercial wealth was very close. Trade in the rest of medieval Europe was mostly facilitated through roads and river networks. Roads and rivers that could be controlled by different lords who would then extract tolls from any merchants who used them. However, no aristocrat owned the North and Baltic seas. If you wanted to take part in the Hanseatic trade, all you needed to do was build a boat, load what you had to sell, and set out into the sea. This gradually started to disrupt the manorial economy of medieval Europe in Scandinavia. Trade, or any commercial activity for that matter, was severely restricted throughout medieval Europe. You had to gain trading licenses from kings and pay the heavy tolls that lords put on the use of their roads. As a result of this, economic power lay almost entirely with the aristocracies, unless you lived in a free city. But
I can add a bit about this that I know about economic development and the geographic situation and access to natural resources. I think there are two major things that that has been very predictive of the capabilities for development. Now, this isn't always the case. So, for example, if you look at Africa, a lot of Africa is behind a lot of Europe developmentally, despite the fact that it is incredibly rich in natural resources and that's obviously been impacted by the history of colonialism. So colonialism is obviously like a very, very big modifying factor that can change a lot of what I'm about to say. But regardless, access to natural resources and also being an important like focal points or like concentrated points when it comes to trade are two very important things that are very predictive of like economic development and wealth accumulation. So for example, I can talk about Sweden a bit. Sweden has access to quite a bit of natural resources. I think it's stone and timber that they had a lot of access to, and this came in very much handy for Sweden's development after World War II. So before World War II, I mean, Sweden was an all right developed country, but it wasn't like pictured as it is today as like a country that has gone pretty far on like the social and economic development index, and that is like a fairly well developed country. But after World War II, largely due to Sweden's neutrality, a lot of the broader parts of Europe really need to rebuild because a lot of them have been bombed back basically into the Stone Age. And in the process of rebuilding, a lot of the resources, the natural resources that Sweden had access to were really, really, really important, like stone and timber. And I think there were even some things about like energy sources like petroleum, but I'm confident about the stone and timber thing there. And because of that, they were able to engage in a lot of trade because there was a lot of demand for the natural resources that Sweden had. And Sweden got really, really, really wealthy, really, really quick. And since that point, Sweden has been known as more of this like, utopian, more like developed society. And that's kind of like where that really started after World War II. So a combination of both its neutrality during World War II and the access of resources it had that were important to the rebuilding of Europe after World War II kind of propelled Sweden up in the developmental index. So that's one thing. So access to natural resources allows you to take more advantage of these opportunities while also doing a lot of the things that Kraut are talking about here. But then there are other societies, like for example, if you talk about Singapore. So when it comes to natural resources, Singapore doesn't really have much. It's also a very, very, very small space. Like Singapore doesn't have any. Singapore is a country and a city. It's both in one because it's so tiny. But because of its position, so for those of you who don't know, Singapore is located right here at the very tip of the bottom of Malaysia down here. And because of its position, it's a very like valuable position when it comes to trade routes, specifically through maritime trade, where you will have a lot of boats coming in from the Indian Ocean, like up around here, and then coming from the Pacific Ocean here, going up to China, Japan, Philippines, and then India and Africa, and through here to like broader parts of Europe as well. It's a very strategic location, and because of that, because there's a lot of trade going around the area, it's going to be obviously very valuable to have like a sort of a big, what's the right station? Port, a big port. And there's a lot of trade to be made there, a lot of resources to be exchanged. So they were able to accumulate a lot of wealth there, despite them not being very rich in natural resources, because it's in a very strategic location where you will have a lot of boats and trade going by. You can capitalize off that and generate more money that way. But once again, colored by the history of colonialism, because Singapore was for a very, very large part a British colony. And once again, when it comes to the resource stuff I was talking about, that's not always the true. History of colonialism affects a lot of this, specifically like Africa, for example, as an example of like a place that's very, very resource rich, yet hasn't seen the same type of like economic development as, for example, Sweden has, as being the example I talked about before. So yeah, the amount of like the resources and the geographic location, super important for economic development. It allows you to get more opportunities and also take more advantage of situations that exist in order to generate more wealth and progress further when it comes to development. But yeah, let's keep going.
But in Scandinavia, no king and no lord had the means to regulate and tax the sea. Commercial activity therefore began to spread among the Scandinavian peasantry, unrestricted by the aristocracy, thereby shaping the peasantry as a political force in struggle with the aristocracy earlier than in many other societies. Another geographic factor is Scandinavian iron ore. The abundance of iron ore, in particular in Sweden, resulted in an immigration of skilled metalworkers from Germany that helped establish a metalwork industry by the late Middle Ages, establishing an additional economic sector outside of aristocratic control. The final geographic factor was the high latitudes with their extremely cold winters. Winters always necessitate.
How are you gonna talk about Denmark and call them extremely cold, bro? Unbelievable.
storage economies that save harvests and fuel for the duration of the winter months. And in Scandinavia, especially cold and long winters facilitated an especially extensive storage economy. Over the centuries, this created a tradition of communities working together for a common good, and a social attitude that saw good times as an opportunity to prepare for bad times, not just as individuals, but as a community. Through the storage of supplies as a community, common economic institutions were established by a peasantry that were run by that peasantry. Scandinavian communities started to create communal institutions for the wider benefit of their society, run by them and trusted by them earlier than anywhere else. This is an aspect often mischaracterized and misunderstood by outsiders. Infamously, the American far right likes to deride this aspect of Scandinavian society as communism, even though it came into existence centuries before Marx was even born. Equally false, Marxists enjoy describing it as socialism, even though its establishment during medieval feudalism contradicts Marxist theory of history and developmental stages, and it didn't come to be through class struggle as Marxist theory demands, but through cold weather. We should, however, be careful not to overemphasize.
Yeah, so that's another good point. So the storage economy is very important, obviously, in Sweden. Now, this is pretty much true for the entirety of human history, where you will have the period where you are able to produce a lot of crops, and then you kind of hope that your crop production there will carry you through the times where there might be droughts, or the conditions for growing crops and agriculture, and maybe even agriculture is a lot worse than what they initially are. And in colder countries, especially like in northern Scandinavia, this is very, very, very much the case, where you have, a period of time where you have conditions that are kind of conducive to agriculture. You have some sun going on, you have decent temperatures, especially actually during the summer. You will have a lot of hours of sunlight, which is obviously helpful, for the development and the growing of agriculture. You probably want more sunlight than less sunlight. But then, as the winter months start coming around, it is extraordinarily harsh. You will get, especially back then, you will get a lot of snow. You will get very, very few hours of sunlight. So you don't even have to be that far like north in Sweden, but the sun will set at like 3 p.m. sometimes, and even like right now, that's absolutely the case. So you will get very few hours of sunlight. It will be cold. Conditions aren't going to be great for growth. So you really, really have to cross your fingers and try to do the best out of the periods of time you have where you have good agriculture production, and then hoping that will carry you throughout. And the development of cooperative structures, like what Kraut is talking about this video, where you have like a more sharing culture, and you have a system where you have better levels of distribution, and you can count on the people around you in the harsh times, like in the winter months. That's obviously going to be helpful for human growth and human development in those regions. So yeah, absolutely, this is it's true pretty much. But yeah, let's keep going.
Emphasized the importance of geography in political development. Cold climates necessitating storage economies also existed in Russia. There, however, the monarch was able to cement an absolutist state institution. Shorelines favoring trade by sea also existed in Britain, but the English aristocracy managed to maintain control over the trade ports, and the monarch remained powerful enough to control trade monopolies. Scandinavia went through this political development on its own, and in a unique way, and the ultimate result of it was that while most of Europe exited feudalism with political conflict between an aristocracy and monarch over the establishment of an absolutist state, Scandinavia exited feudalism with a significantly more empowered peasantry than the rest of Europe.
I do want to add something else as well, and he touched on this before when he talked about, well, Americans will call this commie garbage. A lot of maybe more hardline Marxists and left-wing people will say, oh, this is the advent of communism or whatever that put Europe in the position that it's in right now. I often find that these types of broad meta-narratives for describing society, I don't think they are very helpful. I think that there's a lot of departments in which they fall pretty short. More than anything, it's going to be because you're looking for a pattern, which I don't necessarily blame you for. Like, human beings are very, like, inherently driven towards pattern recognizing behavior and trying to sort of extrapolate and project what you do know or currently existing theories onto things, regardless of whether or not they fit perfectly or not. And the issue with like really broad, like meta societal narratives is that because you can, use like a very like strict lens of analysis towards going through like historical developments and stuff like that, you can miss out on a lot that doesn't really necessarily intuitively fit within the framework of your broad meta narrative. And this kind of stems a bit as well. Let me see if I can remember this properly. Actually, never mind. That's not relevant to this particular discussion. Inductive and deductive theory production. I don't think it's too relevant to what we're talking about here. But if you have, if you just have a theory and you're just trying to look at everything from theory, you can miss out on a lot of things. You can overlook some things, and you can kind of stretch things here and there to make it fit into your exact theory. When probably more productive ways, like actually trying to see and establish, okay, this is what happened, this is probably the contributing factors, and then maybe try to make like a theory from there. But then when you have a new situation, something new take place, don't just copy paste the existing theory onto the thing and be like, well, it more or less fits, we can kind of try to explain it with this. Always try to analyze each situation first and then see how it plays into the theory, instead of having a theory and putting on the theory goggles and looking at the situation through the theory goggles, because you might miss out on a lot of things. So yeah.
One of the most significant events that led to the establishment of a social commitment to a common public good in Scandinavia was the Protestant Reformation. The Reformation almost coincided with the breakup of the Kalmar Union, a union kingdom that had united all of Scandinavia. Out of its collapse, Denmark emerged with Iceland and Norway under its rule, but also with a crisis of governance and monarchy. During the Middle Ages, the Riksrat, a council of aristocrats and bishops, had gained significant power from the king. At the beginning of the Protestant Reformation, a crisis in succession to the throne led to the Riksrat postponing the election of a new king and governing the country. The aristocracy was in theory meant to represent the general public, but in most cases the aristocracy used the parliamentary assemblies to gain power at the expense of the king to then take advantage of the peasantry. As Lutheranism spread among the peasantry and lower nobility, it set them up against the aristocracy and the Catholic bishops. Civil war broke out, and using the support of a Protestant peasantry and lower nobility, Christian III seized the Danish throne in 1536. Christian was a very zealous Protestant who established a national Lutheran church and furthered Lutheranism throughout Denmark. And Lutheran theology, combined with the already more empowered Danish peasantry, manifested a substantial change in Danish society. A core principle of Lutheranism is that everyone should be able to read, understand, and interpret the Bible. That faith must be made available and accessible to all for themselves, through themselves, and to not be dictated to them by a religious authority. In Denmark, this resulted in Lutheran priests increasingly teaching the peasantry how to read and write. Literacy exploded among the Danish peasantry. Denmark was probably the first fully literate society of Europe. To further this, the Danish...
So you can say what you want about like religious practices. I can imagine that there might be a lot of people who see this and I'm like, oh, cringe, read the Bible, religious, cringe, our atheist moment. But you might have like more people like seeing, okay, religion, and then you kind of like turn your brain off there. But the main thing that they're focusing on here is that sure, the end goal of like doing this like increasing literacy thing in order to allow people to be able to be more faithful when it comes to religious services, regardless of what we think about the end goal by contemporary standards, we still need to recognize the important aspects in the development and in the process towards that goal and how valuable those given parts. Because the increase of literacy and the ability for people to engage and communicate in society, I think, is some of the most important aspects of general societal development. And I'm reminded of this this discussion topic that often comes out, whether or not democracy is just a decision-making process. For me, the answer to that is absolutely no. Democracy is not just, pulling up and putting like a little piece of paper in a ballot with your name on it and then seeing what happens. I don't think that's an aspect of democracy, but that's not the entirety of democracy. I think for you to be able to have a meaningful democracy, you need a population that can effectively and reasonably, have good critical thinking skills, develop their own opinions, weigh different arguments against each other, communicate in an effective way in order to reach conclusions in what they want to do in the country. I don't think you have a true and a proper democracy unless you have good focuses on things like literacy, unless you have important things like freedom of the press and freedom of speech, unless you have important things like the education of good critical thinking skills and good public discourse for people to think about ideas and then vote accordingly. Unless you have all those very important things, I don't really think you have like a proper democracy. And in that, I think that the things that are being accomplished right now through the, in this case, religious development in, Denmark, is going to be a pretty important thing nevertheless. And I do also want to take this opportunity to point out a general thing that I often see talked about or often see done when people talk about religious, especially in like more progressive and left-leaning circles, is that people will often be very quick to completely dismiss religion and everything it has accomplished and all the purposes it has in general society. I think that religion touches on something that is very, very important and is an easy way to cultivate the following. It is an easy way to cultivate a good sense of community and a good sense of identity among the people who participate in religious practices. And from what we've seen, we can see that religious, participation and stuff like that, and participation in religious institutions does have a lot of positive effects for individuals' well-being and for their risks of, mental health issues, for their social life, and a wide range of different metrics. And for that, religion does have a very valuable purpose. It provides that, and by providing that, it's easier for human beings to function in a way that is healthier towards them. Now, I will still say, though, that I don't think religion is the optimal way by which to accomplish that. I would hope that we societally can move towards a way by which we accomplish that community spirit in other ways than a belief in like a religious idea, or in the belief of a deity or whatever, because I do think that those ideas can lend themselves towards some harmful, ways of thinking, especially in a democracy. But I do think it's very important that we try to capture something that religion has been able to accomplish throughout human history, that sense of community, whether that be through things like, like community service, having more like tight-knit communities that operate like in more collaboration with each other. I know there were some ideas thrown around where people might need to engage in some form of like mandatory, or at least very heavily recommended community service with the people around them, where they go around and they do important things for their community, like, clean up, do different forms of like charity work, or maybe look or brainstorm about new potential plans for the development of your local communities. Really anything, but I think that sense of community is very important to foster it. And for that, I think religion's done a good job at fostering that sense of community. But religion obviously has a bunch of negative consequences as well, which hopefully we try to get rid of while still trying to maintain that sense of community that exists. So yeah, basically, conclusion, don't turn your brain off just because you hear like religious going on. You need to recognize the importance of religion in the historical development of humankind, while also being, reasonably critical of its outcomes and what is really intrinsic to religion, while also recognizing the good parts that we want to accomplish through some other means, like, more like community service oriented stuff and behaviors. But yeah, let's keep watching.
Lutheran Church built public schools in every village across Denmark to teach everyone how to read and write, and by the end of the 1500s, this system of schools had developed into a full-fledged public schooling system. 3 centuries later, Denmark would be in fact the first country to introduce a compulsory public schooling system in 1813. Denmark, earlier than others through literacy, developed its peasantry into a well-organized...
Oh no, Demon Mama wouldn't be happy about that. Jesus Christ. That's why Demon Mama hates Scandinavia so much. That's why she made fun of me for being like Scandinavia Euro-brained. Ah, makes sense. I got it. Maybe she confused Denmark for Sweden. Maybe that's why. Okay.
An educated social class, a social class that had a vested interest in a common good of society, mobilized through the religious doctrines of Lutheranism and supported through economic structures established long before. And that social class started to act more assertively and demand more political powers in the late 1600s and early 1700s. The Danish monarchs still tried to build an absolutist state with power centralized in the monarch, just as every European monarch did. And just as in the rest of Europe, they mainly had to contend with the Danish aristocracy. Unlike in England, there was no permanent binding legal charter like the Magna Carta. Instead, each new Danish king had to sign a new charter called the Handfæsting, and struggled with the Danish aristocracy over which powers, rights, and privileges to grant and seize. After losing a war against Sweden in 1660...
Based! Okay, never mind. This is a good video. This is gonna be my new wallpaper.
The monarch used the resulting crisis to abolish the aristocratic parliamentary assembly and formally establish an absolutist state. This absolutist state, however, continued to remain in conflict with the political and economic ambitions of the Danish aristocracy. As a result, starting in the 1700s, something unique happened. The Danish kings started using the power of the absolute Danish state to increase the privileges and rights of the peasantry. The kings increasingly abolished the last vestiges of serfdom. They abolished the aristocratic right to use corporal punishment against tenants. Peasants were granted the right to privately own and inherit land. And the remaining restrictions on commercial activity in favor of aristocrats were lifted from the peasantry. Why did the Danish kings do this in pursuit of an absolutist state? Because the increasing enfranchisement of the peasantry came at the expense of the aristocracy, who were the main political obstacle to the king. This political development in social classes is very unique to Scandinavia. In England, the aristocracy and the monarch found a compromise that empowered the aristocracy as protectors of the monarchy in exchange for rights and privileges.
So you could hypothetically, so I know I mentioned before how like meta narratives are a bit difficult, but I think that every kind of like meta narrative that we talk about, whether that be, you know, certain elements of like class struggle, I think that there's still important implementations of all those that can adequately explain certain parts. So in this given case, while obviously just saying like class struggle, Lamau, and throwing your hands up isn't exactly explanatory of every single facet of human development, in this case, there was an element of class struggle going on, except for in this case, it wasn't like the proletariat versus the bourgeoisie, but it was the class struggle between the royalty and the aristocracy. And the solutions or the outcomes of that conflict in Denmark, like they points out, is very different than that in Great Britain. So once again, meta narratives, or at least the type of general thing that they're pointing out is like, oh, this is the key driver of history. They all have a part to play, and they all undeniably have different degrees of influence on society as a whole. But the kind of like more purist thinking of like, okay, it can only be this or only be this, which is easier to do because if you have one simple explanation and you try to throw that onto everything, it makes it a lot easier than having to learn and analyze and looking at different angles of different things. But regardless, there's still important things to learn from it. And in this given case, you have like a case of unconventional, I suppose, class struggle leading to the things that they're talking about here and the outcomes it had for the general, like the peasant or worker class.
Prussia, the monarch recruited the aristocracy as officers in the building of a professional army and its bureaucracy to rule the state as a militaristic dictatorship. In France, the king struggled with the aristocracy to subdue them into the creation of an absolutist state at the expense of everyone else. In Russia, the king subdued the aristocracy and recruited them in an alliance to exploit the peasantry in an almost perfect absolutism. In Poland, the aristocracy formed a powerful political bloc that undermined the power of the king and state, so they could exploit the peasantry on their own. In contrast to all of these European political developments, what makes the Danish and Scandinavian political developments so unique is that the king empowered the peasantry and recruited them as allies to undermine the political ambitions of the aristocracy.
And then once again, a perfect encapsulation of like, hey, even though you might have like a generally similar phenomena of some form of like class struggle occurring, the outcomes that could have, depending on the given context in which that happens and the given nation state and a wide range of factors that could have occurred, perfectly by chance, such as like the geography point that was mentioned before, can have very, very, very different outcomes. And thus it kind of suffers an explanatory power sometimes if you just try to like steamroll like one explanation out of everything. Because hey, even like one explanation, one phenomena, like the phenomenon of class struggle, can lead to a lot of different outcomes based on a wide range of contextual factors that some of them are probably, like more calculable, more predictable, while some of them are probably a lot more random. So
Empowered peasantry had a deciding impact on Denmark throughout the 1700s and 1800s. It is, for example, a reason why Denmark never extensively took part in European imperialism. The small Danish colonies in the Caribbean, India and West Africa were run by the Danish East India Company and were basically aristocratic monopoly ventures granted by the king or run by the king. They never enjoyed much public support. The evolving Danish citizenry saw the pursuit of wealth through conquests abroad as a waste, when efforts could be made instead to build prosperity at home. What finally brought democracy to Denmark, though, was not an internal development, but outside events that acted as a catalyst for internal political developments. During the Napoleonic Wars, Denmark sided with Napoleon and lost, which resulted in Denmark losing control of Norway to Sweden. But
based Sweden. Anyway, I just have to point that out whenever Sweden does something cool. Anyway, I do think maybe there's something missing here a bit. I understand the point that is being made where it says like, okay, why focus internationally? We can focus that stuff here at home. But I mean, if you talk to like people, like colonialists back then, they would probably make the argument that, hey, by creating these colonies, we're making things effectively better back home because we have access to new resources, new completely voluntary labor forces. It's like, you can still kind of like extrapolate the same argument. So I don't know how much I agree with like maybe the ideology, or that's like the driving ideology or idea behind what's going on, but that's the way it manifested itself. So maybe there's something missing here exactly for why Denmark decided to focus more domestically while focusing internationally, because the excuse, oh, we're doing whatever's best for like our country. I could see somebody who, or like a nation that engaged in colonialism, using or employing that same argument for their ends. So maybe there's something missing here. That could be, once again, a thing depending on like the factors of like geographic location in regards to the ease of, like transport, or the ease of, the ability to do colonialism, so to say, where Denmark is kind of, it's a bit like it. So if you look on like a map, so let's see here, world map. Maybe it could be the case that due to Denmark's like position, it's a bit more difficult for it to like travel around, especially on the big sea, since it's kind of like in like a little pocket, I suppose, of Europe. Let's see, we could do Europe map, and then we can get it a bit better as compared to like France or United Kingdom, which have big access to port area here. How Denmark is kind of in like a little corner there. How might make that a bit more difficult. So maybe that kind of like weighed the calculus for whether or not that was deemed like as a profitable or worthwhile engagement to go over. So geography could be an aspect there, but yeah, I think that there's probably something missing a bit here in that explanation for why Denmark decided to not engage in as much colonialism as compared to the other nations. But yeah, we still did have colonialism, yeah, absolutely, and he points it out here, but quite as much as a lot of the other like comparable nations might have had. But yeah.
But far more crucially, the German states received the right to interfere within internal political Danish matters because of the German populations in the provinces of Schleswig-Holstein. Class-based calls for political representation and rights now clashed with the ambitions of a wealthy German aristocracy of Schleswig-Holstein.
Yeah, that could be a thing, right? Because Denmark still, I'm reading a bit of chat right now, because Denmark still had colonies, but at least from what's being said here and from my rudimentary understanding of history, it doesn't seem like they had, definitely not as much as, you know, countries like France and the United Kingdom had. And maybe that's why, maybe there wasn't so many real ideological differences between, you know, their ability to want to focus on domestic development as opposed to colonialism. Maybe it was just that, hey, they had like a general like idea or general like similar will towards engaging the different practices, but due to like geographical and you know, questions of resources, Denmark was just able to do it to a lesser extent. Like if Denmark was in the position of France or the United Kingdom, maybe they would have done just as much colonialism as France or the United Kingdom did, but just depended on their position. So I don't know how much about like prescribing these like core like ideological differences between Denmark and, you know, France and the United Kingdom would have been. But yeah, let's keep watching.
In internal political Danish matters because of the German populations in the provinces of Schleswig-Holstein. Class-based calls for political representation and rights now clashed with the ambitions of a wealthy German aristocracy of Schleswig-Holstein and created conflicts of national identity with the German population. Democracy was no longer just a class-driven political aspiration, but one of national identity. A religious revival movement emerged in the 1840s under Nikolai.
So you can see a lot of similar things between nationalism, as I said before about religion. How, hey, even though, you know, ideally we want to strive towards a society, maybe if you're a more progressive person, like with less religion or with less nationalism, you still don't turn your brain off whenever things are mentioned about like nationalism or religion having positive outcomes of development as a whole. You need to kind of try to look past the biases and examine things in a reasonable capacity, so to say. But yeah.
Friedrich Severin Grundtvig, which mostly rallied small farmers together in demands for a private education system as an alternative to the public system. This movement, called the Grundtvigians, kicked off the establishment of a constitutional democracy with votes granted to all men by 1849. Democratic enfranchisement happened earlier than in the rest of Europe. An additional significant contribution to the creation of the Danish state institution was when Prussia went to war with Denmark over its German minority. Denmark lost the war and consequently lost...
Look at us Swedes over here just laughing at them getting beat up by the Prussians. It was probably a really bloody conflict. Maybe I shouldn't be making these jokes. Maybe I'm taking this Scandinavian rivalry too far. No, I'm not. This is reasonable.
Schleswig-Holstein. This left Denmark a lingually homogeneous society with a public enfranchised by democracy that could consequently engage in the building of a state and common good without outside interference or distractions.
So that's something, I think he touches on something a little bit here. Maybe we get a bit more of the development going on here. How probably the most important aspect of economic development as a whole is national sovereignty, is the strength of institutions, and is the political and, you know, fiscal economic stability of a given nation. If you are suffering on basic metrics of stability and consistency within your country, where you have intense economic ups and downs, where you have very, very corrupt governments, where you can have somebody like invade really quickly, or you can have like another country just enact as much power they want over your country and your laws without you having much of a say in it, it makes that country and that place a lot less desirable for lots of metrics and a lot of key paths for development and economic growth than a more stable country. And this kind of stems back into a lot of like kind of business related stuff, really, when it comes to, you know, like risk management and investments. People are going to be more willing to take risks and to make more investments and to make more developments and to put down more of like an anchor, so to say, in a society that is more stable than one that is very tumultuous. And because of that, nations that tend to have like a lot of stability and a lot of national sovereignty, they tend to grow a fuck ton because they are afforded those extra opportunities, because they're a desirable way, a desirable location for development and for investments, whereas countries that are a lot more tumultuous, that have issues with economic ups and downs, that have, you know, a lot of like overreach and maybe a puppet state or maybe like a colony of another different countries, they suffer a lot more in these given departments because of the inherent tumultuousness and instability of it. That comes with that kind of like control and that instability, which in turn is like a self-perpetuating cycle where, okay, because nothing gets better, it's just going to get worse. Because it's unstable, nobody's going to want to, you know, put down their anchor and like, you know, invest or, you know, develop resources and stuff in that nation. It's going to get worse. It's going to likely be more tumultuous. So it's kind of like a catch-22. Same thing goes for the development things, okay? If you have like a more stable country, you have more investments, you have more people coming over there, more big, you know, infrastructure developments going on there. That's probably going to contribute further to its stability, further to its strength, which is going to draw more people to come over there and more money and more capital to go over to those regions of the world, which is going to give more stability. So it's kind of like, there's a bunch of like, a lot of really kind of ruthless catch-22 cycles, which can either be, you know, propel you upwards very quickly, or that can keep you down or even push you further down when it comes to like international economic development. But yeah.
Let's briefly return to the 1700s. The granting of property rights to small farmers was probably one of the most significant steps in Danish and in Scandinavian political development. This mainly began in Norway under Danish rule during the late 1700s through a process historians called the individualization of agriculture. The customary large landholdings became replaced with small family farms. That small family farm, starting in Norway, over the centuries became the basic unit of production of the Scandinavian economy. When industrialization came, there was consequently no mass disruption of communal structures. Industrialization throughout the rest of Europe mostly transpired through large landholdings, clearing the land, disrupting the craftsman and tenant farm economies. The communities built around these economic sectors fell apart, migrated into cities, became part of the industrial factory work complex, and created a new social class, the working class. That, to a large extent, did not happen in Scandinavia, or at least very differently. The commercialization and industrialization of Scandinavian agriculture was a very slow and gradual process that took from the 1780s to the 1950s. It also remained in control of the small farmers and small business owners and their communities. As a result of this, the strong communal bonds and structures that had developed in the centuries before were preserved. This includes the customs of communal care that evolved out of a peasant winter storage economy. And it should not come as a surprise that most political movements and parties in early democratic Scandinavia have their origins in the Scandinavian countryside. These forces came into political opposition with more urban elites, but within the democratic framework, neither side opposed social institutions of common care.
So once again, this stems back into what I was talking about before, how Sweden, for example, which is the country I know most about, it stayed in that agricultural phase a lot longer than a lot of other countries. Like in this case, they talk about Britain there. And they stayed in the agricultural phase a lot longer, but then post the advent of World War II, when all the resources were really heavily demanded off of Sweden, you really saw like the you know, like economic growth go up really, really quick there for Sweden. And then a lot of those values that came with the more agricultural society, like the more community-driven values that Kraut talks about here, they were maintained more in the very quick developmental process, because you kind of because Scandinavia and especially Sweden kind of skipped over a few steps that a lot of other countries like Great Britain, you know, went through. And because of that, that could be like one of the reasons why you have the kind of ideological bent and why you have the emphasis on certain social and political ends in Scandinavia as compared to a lot of other countries. Because the transition was faster, so those values were more likely to be maintained. Whereas if you had a more like drawn out process where your values were going to be more shifted as you moved into more of the industrial area and the factory, you know, type situation that Kraut talks about here, you might see those values like be chipped away at or just fade away gradually. And then you go into the, you know, more like a more developed era. So you don't really have those same values that you had back in the agricultural era. So once again, like the speed of, you know, development, there are so many, you know, things that you might not think are very significant at a, you know, at a quick glance that end up having massive macro effects in the long term in the historical development of a nation or a continent or whatever. So yeah.
The Grundtvigians, a religious political farmers movement that in the end established a constitutional monarchy in Denmark, are a prime example of this. Their interest was in the shaping of a state that through its institutions represented and set the standards of the moral norms of wider society. Their opposition to the public schools was not as much an opposition to the state as it was an opposition to the Danish monarchy's concept of the word public and common. During their time in government, they renamed the Danish public institutions from being public, such as public schools, to the people's schools. For them, common institutions of care and service for society had to be free institutions, in that they were based on voluntary service to society rather than a state-mandated or dictated service for society. Service to society should not be mandated, it should be something that citizens engage in due to their desire to care for each other. This may seem like a side note, but it is the defining and substantial difference between the formation of the Scandinavian and the German ideals for a common good and welfare state. If you went to school in Germany, you were probably taught that Bismarck invented our public healthcare system, but that is not true. The first German public healthcare system were insurance pots created by Prussian factory workers in the 1860s. Those signed labor union agreements to add a percentage of their earnings into a common healthcare pot. When this became widespread in Germany, Bismarck mandated it and built state institutions that seized control over these insurance pots as a state-run public health sector. Bismarck did not do this because he cared for the health of the German factory worker. He did this because he feared the German factory worker was creating an institution independent and outside of the absolute militaristic Prussian state. The German welfare state was created as a mechanism of state control. In contrast, the Scandinavian welfare state came out of a universalist voluntarism, a social commitment to a common good. By the 1880s, the industrial...
So I think what they're pointing out here, and I'm going to do a lot more research on the healthcare thing, so it's kind of hard for me to say, but the difference between a more like a mandated social service type thing going on and one where people like invest in it voluntarily on the basis of the fact that it has positive outcomes, which I'm not sure how much that ideological difference like matters when it comes to the outcomes specifically. I think that typically if you see like a form of like social investment structure or like a social investment system work effectively, you know, you might as well kind of mandate it in those given situations. So I'm a bit mixed on this right now, but I will be doing more research on healthcare soon. So I'm not going to say too much about this right, you know, at the very moment. But yeah, it'll be interesting how any of this is reflected in the research I do on healthcare.
Industrialization of the Danish economy started to go into full swing earlier than anywhere else in Scandinavia and developed an industrial worker class. While in the rest of Europe, industrialization led to poor houses, strict moral codes, struggles with unions, fear of revolution, Marxist movements and strikes, in Denmark it resulted in a political debate over the arbejderspørgsmål, the worker question, as in to what extent is society responsible to care for the needs of its industrial workers and laborers, and the result was the establishment of the first welfare state. Denmark introduced a public pension fund with an official retirement age of 60 in 1891, a public healthcare system in 1892, a public workers accident insurance in 1898, unemployment insurance was passed in 1907, and disability benefits introduced in 1913. The Scandinavians championed something new during the late 19th century. State programs for social care throughout the world before then usually had been done as poor laws, as a sort of charity, that society would care for the misfortunate. This notion is something that the Scandinavians abandoned, instead advocating for institutions of social insurance and social responsibility. This was combined with a policy of expansion.
I think this is very good, and this is a very absolutely productive way to look at like welfare and stuff like that. I think that if we picture welfare as something like, oh, we do this for them. We do this for the poors. We do this for the disenfranchised. We do it for those type of people. Well, I do think that's like a virtuous goal to have, absolutely. And it's probably like a good attitude to have, like, hey, we're going to care for the people that are that are left behind. And I think that's a very, very important value to have. And I think that's a very important part of humanity and like a humanitarian ideology as a whole. I do think that there's often more productive, and it's often probably like a better conceptualization if you care about the long-term sustenance of these types of public services. If you instead look at the equally true like idea and conceptualization of like welfare and taking care of each other, is like, hey, we're lifting us all up together, because fundamentally, even though you know, like a person may be like very wealthy and they may be well off, they also benefit indirectly from people at the bottom of society also being, you know, raised and being improved. Because the less inequality you see within society, the less people that are below the poverty line, the more, you know, generally people are able to have access to good education, to better healthcare, the more the collective as a whole is able to grow. If you have good access to education, not just for the wealthiest people, you will have a greater educated workforce, which can engage in more types of jobs, which can be more productive, which will elevate the general economic status of the entire country in this given instance. The better access to healthcare you might have, it reduces the risks of, you know, like given plagues or different diseases going around and ravaging different communities and spreading and mutating more, because the general healthcare and the general public health levels are more balanced and are at a higher overall standard. So even if you're at the top, you're less likely to be affected by negative, you know, adverse health outcomes. When it comes to poverty and the effect it might have on, you know, crime because of the poor status of certain like institutions or social structures within people who are in poverty. If you're, you know, even if you're in a wealthier status, by having better overall levels of like economic equality and stuff like that, you reduce the overall incidence of crime and stuff going on in society. And obviously, while crime obviously is mostly contained among, you know, their own social grouping, so you don't often see, like, you know, poor people enacting a bunch of crime on very wealthy people because of, you know, different examples of socioeconomic segregation. It's still something that you're probably going to want to live in a society with less overall crime, regardless of exactly where it's concentrated. So having that kind of like understanding of, you know, welfare and economic development, where it's not just about, oh, it's us helping them, and you get the entire bigger picture where obviously you're helping the people that need it most, but also it is something that is good for everybody unequivocally. It's going to be a lot more productive. It's going to rally a lot more people behind the given cause, and it's going to probably lead to a higher ability for you to sustain those given, you know, policies and welfare states and stuff like that in times of maybe political turbulence and stuff like that. So, so yeah, that's just another view to look at, like welfare and the other types of stuff going on there. But let's keep watching.
Expanding the collection of data throughout the country. Denmark, like no other country, is obsessed with statistics, and that has its origins in the 1890s.
Based data, they're Denmark, so they're not. Okay, I'll give Denmark a bit because they're also they're touching on some data mail stuff going on here. You know, that's my thing. But yeah.
Of social insurance and social responsibility. This was combined with a policy of expanding the collection of data throughout the country. Denmark, like no other country, is obsessed with statistics, and that has its origins in the 1890s.
I think that's something that's very important. I don't think that's talked about enough. The more information you have, the more statistics you have, the more measurements you have, the more data you have, the more everything you have, the easier it is to make good informed decisions on policy and on development and on what you want to do. Having access to information is super basic, because without information, you have some things you can make like theoretical and logical understandings of what's going on in society. But at the end of the day, while you can understand the broad arguments, it's going to be hard to understand how big of an effect those arguments and those like logical, you know, kind of chains, what effects are going to have consequently on the actual real world. And that's where kind of statistics come into play. Because if you talk about any policy, any policy at all, you can think of like 3 or 4 theoretical arguments why that could be good or bad, even for the same metric. Like, okay, you know, a specific taxation policy, they might be good for wealth inequality in this department, but they might also be bad for wealth inequality. Sorry, they might be good for establishing wealth equality in one department because maybe it's more progressive, but theoretically it could also be bad for wealth equality because maybe by increasing the taxes, all the wealthy people move out, and therefore, you know, you kind of see an overall reduction in the amount of money that's in society, and then a lot more people suffer, like economically and stuff like that. Now, those are both like logically arguments that, like, okay, I mean, this could probably happen. There are some incentives that are in place for either one of these two consequences to take place. And that's where the data steps in. Like, okay, so we have like a logical argument for why this is going to be increasing people's socioeconomic status. It's progressive. It focuses more on more heavier taxation burden on the wealthier and less on the more poor people. So people from lower economic status. So it kind of balances that a bit more. But also maybe all the wealthy people just move out and then everybody gets poorer. You have the good logical arguments for both. So let's look at the data. Let's look at what the actual outcomes of these things are. And trying to establish the outcomes logically is very, very difficult. It's impossible for a human being to do that. And that's where data is super important, to really see, okay, how big of a material effect do these theoretical arguments actually have? And therefore, you can then make the argument of like, okay, this is a logical argument, and this is the meaningful material effect it has on the outcomes that we're looking for and looking at. Therefore, we should prefer this, or we should not want to do this, or whatever. So yeah. All in all, from the data mill, data is important. It helps a lot in determining policy and determining what to do.
The Danes established state institutions that by their design existed to collect data and go out of their way to find problems for the state to solve, rather than wait for an unknown problem to fester, grow, and become inevitable to confront. A positive state that exists to serve and work on improving society, rather than a passive state that leaves society largely to itself and only resolves problems when confronting them becomes inevitable. You can see the legacies of this throughout Scandinavia.
So more like preventative versus, you know, caring when something has actually happened, which is not really like a hyper ideological thing. I guess it kind of is. It stems more in like more like equality driven policies and stuff like that. But yeah, obviously we ideally want to prefer preventative things to treating something once it's already arisen and become a problem. But yeah.
Norway has the world's largest sovereign wealth fund, collected out of the revenue of its oil and kept for public investments and as a resource in case things go south. A reason why Denmark leads the world in green energy reform is because it has state institutions built around the state seeking out problems to solve. The Danes consequently tackled climate change and most social and political issues earlier than anyone else. During the interwar...
And Sweden? You gave Norway a compliment, you gave Denmark a compliment, but what about Sweden? Look, we're right there. We're right here. It's even one of the highlighted ones. You highlighted Norway and Denmark, but you're just gonna leave Sweden out to dry? Damn. Okay, Kraut. Holy shit, this is Sweden phobia here. Jesus Christ.
Leads the world in green energy reform is because it has state institutions built around the state seeking out problems to solve. The Danes consequently tackled climate change and most social and political issues earlier than anyone else. During the interwar period, Denmark then pioneered something new again, this time through the newly developed socialist movement, specifically through a crisis in socialism caused by the First World War. Denmark remained outside of this war, but the way in which industrial workers throughout Europe had cheered for and joined that war, and how socialist parties throughout Europe had joined the cause for war, left the Danish socialist movement dismayed and in an identity crisis. It was proof that there was no such thing as a socialist international, no global workers' movement, but that national interests superseded the social political demands of factory workers and countries. The Danish socialists consequently increasingly abandoned the idea of establishing a global international socialism, and opted increasingly for the idea of establishing socialism at home. A functioning national community was seen as a requirement to establish an international community. Then came the 1917 revolution, and this event divided the European socialist movement.
Yeah, so once again, you have more of like the favoring of like a bottom-up approach as compared to like a quick, radical, global, simultaneous revolution towards accomplishing certain political ends.
Into factions who advocated for the proletarian dictatorship, and those who wished to establish socialism through a liberal democratic state. The Scandinavian socialist movements were completely reshaped by the end of the Second World War. In Sweden, they advocated for a folkhemmet, meaning a people's home, and the motto of the Danish Socialist Party became Denmark for folket, meaning a Denmark for the people. People, in this context, being defined as a cultural and public body represented through a public vote. It ties into and builds upon the idea of an institution of common good through voluntarism, and also separates Scandinavia from other definitions, such as the racist German definition of a people as a biological entity of a folk. Social policies in Denmark were not the result of class appeasement or state control, but common commitment to stability. Danish socialists increasingly abandoned Marxist calls for proletarian dictatorship and Marxism, and hence social democracy as a movement was born in Denmark between 1914 and 1929.
This is pretty true, and this is something that's more broadly reflected as well, even in Sweden, when it comes to how a lot of parties, like for example, the left party is a perfect example of this. The left party used to be called Vänsterpartiet Kommunisterna, which is the left party, the communist, kind of rough translation there. And they since completely moved off that. They don't call themselves communists. They even put out like a big thing where like, hey, this is why we no longer call ourselves communists. This is why our policies no longer reflect communist ideals. This is why this is like an actual genuine move towards like away from this movement. And same thing with the social democrats as well. They've moved away from a lot of like explicitly socialist rhetoric that may have existed, you know, like further back. I will note, however, that I think contemporarily it's swayed too far in the other directions, where it's not just like a minor rollback of like a bit like, okay, maybe we should chill with a lot of the like very explicit, like, you know, revolutionary or like hyper explicit socialist rhetoric. It's kind of gone, especially with the Social Democratic Party in Sweden, which I'm incredibly disappointed about, how they have not only compromised on like on things like, you know, political strategy, but they've also, it's not a compromise on a political strategy. They haven't just changed their political strategy, but still retain the main like key values and principal values, but they have compromised on those key principal values. They have gone way too much and swayed way too much to the right, given way too much leeway there in an attempt to stay in political power. And yes, well, to some extent that is something that is commendable, that, hey, you know, you will have at least some form of balancing thing going on there. Fundamentally, if you're compromising on the main things that made you the party that you are, that made you the Social Democratic Party, then you're going to lose your voter base, because you're no longer the same party you were before that was super popular. And more than anything, you're not really getting much done. Your entire function exists as like a limiting factor more than like an active factor in the, you know, political discourse, in the political paradigm. And I think that's a big problem with the Swedish Social Democrats. Social Democrats, is that they've gone a bit too far to the right when it comes to compromising and you know, moving just further right in the economic paradigm. And obviously they've taken the other parties with them. So for example, the left party obviously has had to follow along. The left party right now, and the beliefs that they have, are like the social democratic values from like 20 years ago, 30 years ago maybe. So yeah, everything has moved quite a bit to the right, and I think it's hurting Sweden in a lot of really meaningful ways, especially when it comes to infrastructural development, which I've talked about a bunch of times. I'm sure any video you look up of me on Sweden, I'll mention this to some extent, so I'm not going to go into it in great depth here. But yeah, I think it's something that's definitely hurting Sweden. But let's keep going.
The Danish resistance leader against Nazi occupation, Hal Koch, probably described best what made Scandinavian democracy so unique. He stressed the difference between a protective democracy, which has certain rights and laws enshrined as unviolatable under any circumstances, like the United States with its constitutional amendments, and the developmental democracy, which is a democracy that evolves with time to adapt to new cultural, economic, and social realities. Denmark, and all Scandinavian states for that matter, are developmental democracies that adapt to new cultural and economic developments for a common good. That is something that in many ways separates Scandinavian democracy from other forms of democracy, and it is how Denmark got to Denmark. There's a note on which I want to end this video. This entire development that I described here is what many historians consider the founding structures of a political movement called social democracy, and Denmark to be the birthplace of social democracy. And that contradicts what a lot of people believe and have heard, because the German social democrats always claim that they invented social democracy. Well, they're actually kind of lying, both to you and themselves. The German SPD used to be called the Socialist Party. It came to be as a Marxist-socialist movement in industrial Prussia. It advocated for the overthrow of capitalism and the establishment.
The audio mixing, this final part is a bit, it's a bit hard to hear what he's saying because the pianos is really loud, but yeah, let's keep it.
Of socialism. So when did the German Socialist Party become the Social Democratic Party? Well, during the Nazi regime, a lot of German and Austrian socialists went to exile in Scandinavia. This includes Willy Brandt, who even married a Norwegian, and the Austrian Bruno Kreisky. It was during this exile in Sweden, from 1933 to 1945, where the German Democratic Left was born. At the end of the Second World War, the German Socialist Party kept losing elections advocating for socialism. Then Brandt became the leader of the German party, and Bruno Kreisky became the leader of the Austrian party. They changed their parties into adopting a more Scandinavian political outlook and social principle, embracing democracy and abandoning Marxism and socialism, renaming themselves as Social Democratic, emphasizing the democratic part, and were consequently elected chancellors of both their respective countries. They then established social democracy so well that German Social Democrats get away with claiming that they invented it. After the collapse of the Franco regime, Willy Brandt, who worked as a socialist activist in Barcelona during the Spanish Civil War, helped Felipe González reshape the Spanish Socialist Party into a social democratic party. In many ways, this Danish idea has conquered much of the European democratic left, from Germany to Spain to Austria to Italy. It also failed in some places. Neil Kinnock tried to turn the British Labour Party into a social democratic party and failed at the process. But there's still a good reason why I want to end this video on that note. My videos often describe century-long political developments resulting in our modern institutions, and many in my audience get the impression from these videos that this means we are prisoners of history, that it is close to impossible to effectively change and reform a social or state institution established throughout many centuries. And that is not the case. I believe that this example, more than anything else, proves that point. You can get to Denmark. The question only is, should you? In the next video, we will discuss the...
Okay, overall, I think this was a really good video. Three things that I want to point out. Three things of constructive criticism I have. Number one, like I mentioned, this outro part, the German rebrand part, it's way too loud. It was difficult to hear what was being said at times, so the mixing for that was a bit iffy. Number two, I'm not sure about the second part here when they talked about like the ideological drives and the difference in engagement in colonialism. Like I mentioned before, I think that there's some missing analysis there. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me when I just listened to it here and thought about it for a little bit. But then number three, okay, and this is the most important point. Why is Denmark? So you mentioned Sweden and Norway a bunch, but I failed to see why it's Denmark. That's like the main thing here. There might be good reasons for that. Maybe it's my Swedish spirit flaring up a bit here. But yeah, I think that would have been interesting where you distinguish like, okay, so why have we said how Denmark invented social democracy, not like how Scandinavia invented social democracy? Because I'm still not sure about why the focus was on Denmark there specifically, when obviously it should have been in Sweden. Like, come on, Kraut, get your shit together. But yeah, overall pretty good video. I liked it, and yeah, these were my thoughts on it. I think there's a lot of interesting different directions we could take this. Thank you very much for letting me steal your content, Kraut. Appreciate it. And once again, because I basically yoinked your entire video, he has a sponsorship. It's for Kamikoto Japanese kitchen knives. Yay. I don't have a sponsor myself, so I'm going to shout out other people's sponsors. But yeah, thank you very much.